My name is Clara Whitmore, and I'm 34 years old. Sitting in the back of Mr. Bennett's mahogany-paneled office, I watched my siblings. James was adjusting his cufflinks, Vicky was checking her reflection in her phone, and Ethan was already scrolling through luxury car listings. "Clara," Mr. Bennett said, his voice cutting through the silence. He didn't look at a ledger or a deed. Instead, he reached into a small velvet bag and pulled out something that looked like it belonged in a scrapyard. He dropped it into my palm. It was heavy, cold, and covered in a thick layer of orange rust. A skeleton key. The room stayed silent for exactly 1 second before it erupted. "A key," Vicky shrieked, her laughter sharp enough to shatter glass. She immediately angled her phone toward me, recording. "Grandma left you a piece of literal garbage while I got the Aspen estate. That is peak Aliner." "Look on the bright side, Clara," James added with a condescending smirk, not even bothering to look at me. "If you find the shed it belongs to, maybe we'll let you store your lawnmower there. It's probably all you can afford now." I stood there, my fingers curling around the rough metal. I didn't cry. I didn't shout. I'd learned long ago that reacting only gave them more ammunition. "I understand," I said. That was all, 2 words. My siblings didn't notice the weight of the key or the way Mr. Bennett was watching me with a strange, knowing intensity. They were too busy planning how to spend their millions. They thought they had won the day. They had no idea that while they were holding paper, I was holding the only thing in this room that actually mattered. Growing up a Whitmore, I quickly learned that our family was a stage, and I was merely part of the stage crew. My siblings were the stars, illuminated by the bright, demanding spotlight of my father's ambitions and my mother's social anxieties. James was the golden child, the one destined to carry the name into the boardroom. By the time he was 12, he was already practicing his firm handshake and his even firmer dismissals. Vicky was the darling, a whirlwind of silk and performance who learned early on that a well-timed tear or a calculated smile could get her anything in the world. And Ethan, the youngest, was the prince, shielded from every consequence and allowed to break whatever he touched because he was just a boy. I remember a summer at the lake house when I was 14. It's a memory that tastes like dust and disappointment. James had crashed the motorboat into the pier, Vicky had lost a diamond stud in the sand, and Ethan was screaming because he dropped his ice cream. My parents didn't scold them. Instead, my father looked at me and said, "Clara, clean up the glass on the pier before someone gets hurt, and help your sister find her earring. You're the eldest, make yourself useful." That was my role, the helper. I was the one who stayed behind to organize the library while they went to the country club. I was the one who sat in the shadows of the grand staircase, listening to the adults talk, learning the secrets of their world while they forgot I was even in the room. I became a quiet observer of their greed and their fragility. The only person who truly saw me was Grandma Aliner. While the others were busy demanding their next toy or their next allowance, I was the one who noticed when her tea had gone cold, or when the light in her eyes flickered with a hidden thought. She would watch me from her high-backed velvet chair, her sharp gaze moving from James's entitlement to Vicky's vanity, finally settling on me with a look that was both pitying and prophetic. "They are like kites, Clara," she whispered to me once, her hand, thin and dry as parchment, resting on mine. "They fly high and make a lot of noise, but they are hollow inside. They need the wind to stay up. But you are the ground, and one day the wind will stop blowing." Back then, I didn't understand. I just felt the weight of being the plain one, the quiet one, the one who didn't fit the Whitmore brand. I spent my life being the person who held the door open for them, never realizing that the person who holds the door is also the one who decides when to lock it. After the will reading, the silence of the Whitmore estate felt different, heavier, as if the house itself was holding its breath. James, Vicky, and Ethan had vanished in a cloud of exhaust and self-importance, their laughter still echoing in the cold air. I stood on the gravel driveway, the rusted key heavy in my coat pocket, feeling like an intruder on my own family's land. I began to walk toward the gardens, away from the grand pillars of the manor that had always made me feel small. That's when I saw Samuel Price. Samuel had been the groundskeeper for as long as I could remember. He was a man of few words, with skin like weathered leather and hands that knew the secret language of everything that grew from the earth. He was the only person Alina had trusted with her gardens, and perhaps the only person she had truly called a friend. He was standing by the rose bushes, his shears resting idle in his hand, watching the dust settle where my siblings' cars had sped away. As I approached, he didn't offer the rehearsed condolences I'd been hearing all week. He didn't look at me with the pitying eyes of the townspeople. He simply stepped into my path, his gaze fixed on the pocket where I'd tucked the key. "They didn't see it, did they?" he asked, his voice a low rasp that sounded like dry leaves skittering across pavement. "They saw a piece of junk, Samuel," I replied, my voice steadier than I felt. "They laughed. They told me to buy a lawnmower." A shadow of a smile touched his lips, but it didn't reach his eyes. He stepped closer, ensuring we were out of earshot of the house staff. "Let them laugh, Miss Clara. Laughter is the mask of the blind. Your grandmother spent 60 years surrounded by people who only looked at the price tag of things. She knew that if she gave them gold, they'd spend it. If she gave them land, they'd sell it." He reached out, his rough hand briefly touching my arm. It was the first genuine gesture of support I'd felt since the funeral. "She knew you'd be the only one to keep it, not because of what it's made of, but because of what it represents. To them, it's a burden. To you, it's a map." "A map to what?" I whispered. Samuel looked toward the dense tree line at the northern edge of the property, where the manicured lawns gave way to the wild, unyielding woods. "There's a cottage out there. It's not on the estate maps, and it hasn't been opened since before you were born. The others think the treasure is in the bank vaults downtown. They're wrong. The real history of the Whitmores, the part they tried to bury, is waiting for that key." He leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Go before the sun sets, and Clara, don't tell them where you're going. Let them think you're licking your wounds. It's better if they don't see you coming." By the following morning, the grief that had supposedly weighed down my siblings had evaporated, replaced by the frenzied electricity of newfound wealth. They didn't wait for the estate to clear probate or for the ink to dry on the legal transfers. To them, the promise of the money was as good as the cash in their hands, and they began to spend it with a desperate, hollow intensity. I watched from the sidelines as our family group chat transformed into a scrolling ledger of excess. James was the first to strike. He posted a photo from a shipyard in Florida, standing on the deck of a 60-foot Sunseeker yacht he'd already named the Sovereign. He hadn't even stepped foot back in his office. He was too busy signing financing papers at a staggering interest rate, confident that his $20 million payout would swallow the debt whole. "A king needs a castle that floats," he texted, followed by a series of champagne bottle emojis. Vicky wasn't far behind. She didn't want a boat, she wanted an audience. By noon, she had chartered a private jet to Paris for herself and 5 friends she had barely spoken to in years. She posted a video of herself sipping vintage Bordeaux at 30,000 feet, her lap covered in shopping bags from designers that didn't even have storefronts in our city. "Life is too short for the North Gate," she wrote, a direct jab at the rusted key she assumed was my only inheritance. She was burning through $100,000 a day, convinced the Aspen estate was a bottomless well of gold. But it was Ethan who worried me most. While James and Vicky bought things they could at least see and touch, Ethan was chasing a rush. Lena called me late that night to tell me she'd seen him at an underground casino downtown. He'd lost $50,000 in a single shoe of baccarat, laughing it off as he signed markers against the Whitmore estate. He was a prince who believed his crown was made of indestructible diamond, unaware that it was actually made of melting ice. They were all moving so fast, sprinting toward a finish line they couldn't see. They were intoxicating themselves with the idea of power, using their inheritance to build a fortress of vanity. I sat in my small kitchen, the rusted key sitting on the table next to a lukewarm cup of tea, and realized that my siblings weren't just spending money, they were spending their futures. They were so busy looking at the cash that they failed to read the fine print Alina had spent years drafting. While they were conquering the world on credit, I was preparing to walk into the woods to find the truth. The woods at the northern edge of the Whitmore estate had always been a place of shadows and forgotten things. As I walked, the sound of the world behind me, the distant hum of traffic and the ghost of my siblings' laughter, faded into a heavy, leaf-muffled silence. The path Samuel had pointed out was barely a suggestion, a faint indentation in the earth swallowed by ferns and grasping briars. My designer boots, a gift from Vicky years ago that she deemed too sensible, crunched over rotted logs and damp moss. I felt like a trespasser, not in a forest, but in a memory. I walked for nearly 20 minutes before the trees began to thin, revealing a small clearing that felt untouched by time. There, huddled under the protective canopy of 2 ancient oaks, was the cottage. It was a humble structure of stone and weathered timber, looking less like a house and more like a natural outcropping of the earth. Ivy crawled up the chimney like skeletal fingers, and the windows were thick with decades of dust, staring out like blind eyes. This was the place Alina had loved. Not the marble halls of the manor where she had to play the role of the grand matriarch, but here, in a space that demanded nothing of her. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the rusted key. In the filtered sunlight of the clearing, the orange oxidation looked less like decay and more like a protective skin. As I stepped onto the sagging porch, the wood groaned beneath my weight. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, rhythmic thudding that seemed too loud for the stillness of the woods. I reached for the door handle. It was a heavy piece of iron, cold and unyielding. I slid the key into the lock. For a moment, it wouldn't budge. The rust gritted against the internal tumblers, a stubborn resistance from a mechanism that hadn't moved in 30 years. "Please," I whispered, my voice sounding thin in the open air. I thought of James's yacht, Vicky's private jet, and the hollow arrogance of the life I'd left behind at the manor. I turned the key with everything I had. With a sharp, metallic crack that echoed through the trees, the bolt slid back. The door didn't swing open. I had to shoulder it, pushing against the weight of the air inside. As the door gave way, a scent wafted out, not of rot, but of dried lavender, old paper, and wood smoke. It was the scent of my grandmother's skin. I stepped over the threshold, the floorboards creaking a welcome. The light from the open door cut a golden path through the darkness, illuminating a room filled with books, a simple writing desk, and a stone fireplace. It was small, quiet, and perfectly still. But as my eyes adjusted, I realized this wasn't just a retreat. Every surface was covered in files, ledgers, and sealed envelopes. I hadn't just walked into a cottage. I had walked into a vault of secrets. The golden dust motes danced in the light as I moved toward the heavy oak writing desk. It sat in the center of the room like an altar. On the surface, everything looked ordinary: an inkwell, a pair of reading glasses, a dried rose pressed into a glass paperweight. But as I ran my hand along the underside of the desk's rim, my fingers caught on a small recess lever. With a soft click, a narrow panel in the wainscoting behind the desk popped forward. Inside the wall was a space lined with cedar, containing a single, leather-bound ledger and a stack of letters tied with a black silk ribbon. I took the ledger to the window, the weight of it pulling at my wrists. As I flipped through the pages, the peaceful atmosphere of the cottage was pierced by the cold reality of the ink. This wasn't a diary. It was a meticulous record of every cent that had moved through the Whitmore family business over the last decade. In the margins, in Alina's sharp, elegant cursive, were notes that made my stomach turn. James, May 14th. Diverted $1.2 million from the construction fund to a shell company in the Caymans. Further down, Victoria, September. Art acquisition funds used to settle personal gambling debts in London, disguised as charitable donations. Even Ethan, the baby of the family, had his own section. He had been skimming from the employee pension fund to fuel his impulsive lifestyle. Confident that no one was watching, I sat on the small wooden chair, my breath coming in shallow hitches. My siblings hadn't just been entitled, they had been thieves. They had been cannibalizing the family legacy while Alina was still alive, convinced the old woman was too frail to notice the disappearing numbers. They thought they were smarter than her. They thought her silence was a sign of senility, when in reality, it was the silence of a hunter waiting for the right moment to strike. I untied the silk ribbon on the letters. The first one was addressed to me. "My dearest Clara," it began, the ink slightly faded but the intent crystal clear. "If you are reading this, you have found the courage to look beyond the rust. Your siblings believe that wealth is a prize to be snatched. They do not understand that a legacy is a responsibility to be guarded. I knew they would try to strip the bones of this family before I was even in the ground. I have allowed them to think they succeeded, giving them just enough rope to hang themselves with the morality clause in my will. The letter detailed how the cash and properties they were currently flaunting were not absolute gifts, they were conditional. They were traps set by a woman who knew her heirs better than they knew themselves. I looked back at the ledger, realizing that the junk key hadn't just opened a cottage. It had opened the door to the evidence that would strip James, Vicky, and Ethan of everything they had ever stolen. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel like the helper. I felt like the judge. The drive back from the cottage felt like moving through a dream, the heavy ledger on the passenger seat acting as an anchor to a reality my siblings couldn't yet see. I didn't go back to the manor. Instead, I met Mr. Bennet at his private residence, a modest brick house far from the gilded towers of the financial district. He was waiting for me in his study, the air smelling of old pipe tobacco and law books. Beside him stood Samuel Price, his cap held respectfully in his hands, his eyes sharp with a quiet, knowing fire. I placed the leather-bound ledger on the desk between us. The morality and stewardship clause had sounded like a footnote during the will reading, a bit of legal jargon my siblings had ignored in their rush to claim their millions. Now, as Mr. Bennet turned the pages of the ledger, his face remained a mask of professional calm, though his fingers lingered on the entries detailing James's offshore accounts and Vicky's fraudulent art deals. "Your grandmother was a strategist, Clara," Mr. Bennet said, his voice low and rhythmic. "She knew that simply disinheriting them would lead to years of messy litigation. She wanted them to expose themselves. The clause states that any heir found to have engaged in financial impropriety or ethical degradation during the 5 years preceding her death, or within 30 days following it, forfeits their entire claim to the primary estate." "And the credit they're using right now?" I asked, thinking of the yacht and the private jets. "It's a house of cards," Mr. Bennet replied, a small, thin smile touching his lips. "They are borrowing against assets they don't legally own yet. The moment I trigger the audit of character based on this evidence, the banks will freeze every line of credit. The deeds will revert to the trust. And the trust, according to the final codicil, will be managed by the only heir who demonstrated the patience to seek the truth." Samuel stepped forward, his voice a gravelly rumble. "I saw James this afternoon, Miss Clara. He's already planning to sell the Northgate Woods to a developer. He thinks it's just empty land." "He thinks he can sell what he doesn't understand," I said, feeling a cold, crystalline clarity settle over me. For years, I had been the shadow, the one who smoothed over their messes and stayed silent in the face of their cruelty. But Alina hadn't given me a key to a shed. She had given me the keys to the kingdom. "When do we move?" I asked. Mr. Bennet looked at his watch. "They've invited the local press to the manor tomorrow night for a grand inheritance gala. They want to flaunt their wealth to the world. I suggest we let them have their party. It's always more dramatic when the lights go out at the height of the celebration." I nodded, the weight of the secret finally feeling like power instead of a burden. The trap was set, and my siblings were currently dancing right into the center of it. The Whitmore Manor was ablaze with light, every chandelier polished to a blinding sheen for the grand inheritance gala. The air smelled of expensive lilies and the salt of caviar, but beneath the perfume, it felt like the deck of a sinking ship. James, Vicky, and Ethan stood at the center of the ballroom, surrounded by a circle of sycophants and local reporters, their voices booming with the unearned confidence of the newly rich. I walked in quietly, wearing the same modest dress I had worn to the funeral, feeling like a ghost haunting a celebration of its own demise. "Look who decided to join the living," James called out, raising a glass of vintage crystal toward me. The crowd parted, and I saw the flushed, arrogant heat in his eyes. He looked like a man who believed he had finally conquered the world. "I was just telling the press about our plans for the Northgate Woods, Clara. Since you're so fond of that rusty little key, I've decided to let you keep the cottage. We'll just build the luxury condos around it. It'll be like a little museum for the common life you love so much." Vicky stepped forward, her neck draped in a diamond collar that I knew from Alina's ledger had been purchased on a predatory line of credit. She looked at me with a piteous, performative sigh. "Oh, James, don't be cruel. Clara, darling, I've set up a small trust for you. It's not much, just a few thousand a month, but it'll keep you from having to find a real job. Consider it a gift from the Golden Trio. We can't have a Whitmore looking like a pauper, even if she was the help." Ethan laughed, leaning heavily against a marble pillar, his speech slightly slurred. "I'll even throw in my old Range Rover, sis. It's better than that bus you take. You can drive it to your little shack in the woods." They stood there, three titans of vanity, offering me charity while they stood on a foundation of stolen sand. I looked at the reporters, their cameras flashing, capturing the image of the three benevolent heirs and their unlucky older sister. I felt no anger, only a profound, chilling sense of detachment. I reached into my clutch and felt the cool, hard edge of the skeleton key. "That's very generous of you," I said, my voice cutting through the laughter like a blade through silk. The room went quiet, sensing a shift in the temperature. "But I think you've misunderstood the situation. You see, a gift is only a gift if the giver has the right to give it." James frowned, his glass pausing halfway to his lips. "What are you talking about, Clara? Don't get cryptic. It's a bad look on you." I saw Mr. Bennet enter through the back of the ballroom, followed by two men in dark, conservative suits. He caught my eye and gave a single, imperceptible nod. "I'm talking about the morality clause, James," I said softly. "And I'm talking about the North Gate key. It didn't just open a door, it opened a vault. And inside that vault, I found everything you've been trying to hide." The music didn't stop all at once. It tapered off into a discordant, confused silence as Mr. Bennet stepped onto the small orchestra dais. The two men in suits took their positions at the exits, their presence radiating a cold, federal authority that made the guests shift uncomfortably. James let out a sharp, nervous laugh, setting his champagne glass down on a passing server's tray with a trembling hand. "Harold, what is this?" James demanded, his voice cracking. "The party isn't over. We were just celebrating the new era of the company." Mr. Bennet didn't look at James. He opened a black leather folder and adjusted his glasses, his face as inscrutable as stone. "The party is indeed over, James. In accordance with the final wishes of Eleanor Whitmore, I am here to execute the secondary codicil of her estate, the one she insisted be read only if certain conditions of character were met." Vicky stepped forward, her face pale beneath her heavy makeup. "What conditions? We've followed everything. We had the reading, we took the deeds." "You took possession of property that was held in a conditional trust," Mr. Bennet interrupted, his voice booming through the silent ballroom. "Eleanor was a woman who believed that wealth without integrity was merely a weapon. She included a morality and stewardship clause that explicitly forbade the use of family assets to cover illegal diversions, personal debts incurred through fraud, or public displays of excess that would bring the Whitmore name into disrepute." He pulled a single sheet of paper from the folder. "Based on evidence recovered from the Northgate cottage, evidence of systematic embezzlement and ethical bankruptcy, the executors have determined that James, Victoria, and Ethan Whitmore have fundamentally breached these conditions. As of 5 minutes ago, all deeds, bank accounts, and lines of credit associated with the Whitmore estate have been frozen." A collective gasp rippled through the room. Ethan stumbled backward, his face turning a sickly shade of gray. "Frozen? You can't do that. I've got markers out. I've got people waiting for their money." "Then you have a problem, Ethan," I said, stepping into the light beside Mr. Bennet. "Because the money isn't yours. It never was. You were given a test, and you failed it before the first week was over." James lunged toward the dais, his face contorted with rage. "You did this. You and that pathetic old man. You think a rusted key gives you the right to take what's mine." "The key didn't give me the right, James," I replied, my voice calm and unwavering. "Your own actions did. You spent Eleanor's legacy on a boat before she was cold in the ground. You treated our family history like a bargain bin." Mr. Bennet cleared his throat, finishing the decree. "Under the terms of the final codicil, the entirety of the Whitmore estate, including the family seat, the business interests, and all liquid assets, is hereby transferred to the sole trusteeship of Clara Whitmore. James, Victoria, Ethan, you have 24 hours to vacate the premises. The cars and jewelry purchased on estate credit will be repossessed immediately." The Golden Trio stood paralyzed as the reporters they had invited began to snap photos, not of their triumph, but of their ruin. The light of the chandeliers felt colder now, reflecting off the rusted key I still held in my hand, the only thing in the room that was truly mine. The morning after the gala, the manor felt like a hollow shell, a monument to a dynasty that had collapsed under its own weight. I watched from the upstairs window as James and Ethan threw suitcases into a taxi, their movements frantic and stripped of their usual grace. Vicky was already gone, having fled in the middle of the night to avoid the creditors who were already circling the gates. They didn't look back at the house, and they certainly didn't look back at me. I was no longer the helper they could lean on. I was the wall they had finally run into. I didn't stay to watch the locks being changed. Instead, I drove to the northern edge of the property and walked the familiar, overgrown path one last time. The woods felt lighter today, the air crisp and clean as if a long-standing fever had finally broken. When I reached the clearing, the cottage sat in the soft morning light, looking less like a ruin and more like a sanctuary. I stepped onto the porch and sat on the top step, the rusted key resting in my open palm. For 30 years, I had defined myself by what I lacked: the loud confidence of James, the radiant beauty of Vicky, the effortless charm of Ethan. I had spent my life waiting for a seat at a table that was built on lies. But as I looked at the small, sturdy stone house Alina had left me, I realized she hadn't given me a consolation prize. She had given me the only honest thing the Whitmores ever owned. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a message from Lena. "The headlines are calling you the Silent Queen. How does it feel?" I didn't reply. The noise of the world, the titles, and the sudden fascination of the public felt like static. I looked at the key. The rust had stained my skin, leaving a faint orange mark that wouldn't wash away easily. It was a brand of sorts, a reminder that value isn't found in the shine, but in the strength of what lies beneath. I wasn't going to live in the manor with its cold marble and echoing hallways. I was going to stay here, where the ground was solid and the air was quiet. I realized then that the key hadn't just opened a heavy oak door or a hidden compartment in a desk. It had unlocked the cage I had built for myself. I was no longer the quiet observer of other people's lives. I was the architect of my own. I stood up, tucked the key safely into my pocket, and turned to look at the woods. The path ahead was still wild, still unmapped, but for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid to walk it alone. I breathed in the scent of cedar and damp earth, closed my eyes, and finally I was home.